Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to Thought on Tap. Thank you for coming. This is your monthly news, views, and brews, as we say at Thought on Tap, brought to you by the Core Humanities Program and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Nevada, Reno. My name is Stephen Pasqualina. I'm a postdoctoral scholar in Core Humanities and one of the co-organizers for Thought on Tap. This is our second session of our third season, which will be held entirely online. We're looking forward to getting back to our home at Laughing Planet whenever that's safe and possible. If you're new to Thought on Tap, I'd like to welcome you. And if you're returning, of course, thanks for coming back. We're a public engagement series that brings together diverse faculty, staff, students, and community members for important conversations around timely topics, such as today's topic. We host events on the second Thursday of every month during the fall and spring semesters. And we hope that you'll join us again in December and come back in the spring. Our theme for this academic year is legacies broadly. So in the fall, we are quote unquote confronting legacies. First, we confronted legacies of health disparities in October. Today, we're confronting legacies of voter suppression, and in December of policing and violence. In the spring, we'll be building legacies of equity and education, of health and healing, activism and social justice, and economic empowerment. We're now available on YouTube on our channel, thoughtontap.com/YouTube. Tonight, our program will run from 5:30 to 6:30. We'll wrap things up a little bit before 6:30 to say thanks and give you some details on a survey that'll come up after the session in your email. I'll start things off tonight with an introduction to our topic, and then I'll introduce our illustrious panelists, and then I'll pose some initial questions to get the conversation started. We hope that you'll contribute to the conversation in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to ask questions of the panelists. We'll filter those, we'll sort through them and pose those to the panel and kind of let those generate some of the conversation tonight. Let's see. So now on tonight's topic, let's kind of get into that a little bit. Very brief introduction. Confronting legacies of voter suppression. So as you likely know, this is an all too timely topic. First, because this is the 100-year anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, which marked the victory of suffragists who had long fought to enfranchise women across the US. And secondly, as you might know if you've been watching the news, we're living through a national election that is thankfully over, but just won't seem to die. I knew when we planned this session on voter suppression right around the election that we were going to get into, a kind of hot topic, a little bit of a turmoil around the election, but I could not have predicted exactly the shape that this topic would take this November. Before we get into the present, I want to zoom out, right? We're talking about legacies this year, or this semester. So the legacies of voter suppression. In many ways, you could think of the history of US democracy through just the history of voting rights, right? In the first US presidential election in 1789, roughly 6% of the US population was legally allowed to vote. And over time, barriers to the ballot have included property, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, age, and criminal history. There's been progress in all these regards. Today, around 75% of the population is legally eligible to vote. And this is a significant increase, but I think that increase might suggest that voter suppression is, a thing of the past, belongs to the dustbin of history. But this year's elections, I think, certainly have demonstrated that equal voting rights are still not available to all US citizens, and that the topic of voter suppression requires renewed attention and clarity, and I'm hoping that this session helps in that regard. One question on my mind for tonight's session, maybe we'll kind of get there indirectly by the end of the session. What exactly is voter suppression? Is it something with clear-cut parameters that we could easily define? Or is it a fuzzier term that you just kind of know when you see? The most obvious form of voter suppression, like I mentioned, is legally mandated banishments from the ballot box, right? Constitutional denials of the vote or legal denials. But legal reforms alone have not sufficiently solved the problem of access to the ballot, as witnessed in this fall's absurdly long lines at polling places in Georgia, in Texas, Ohio, and other states. Many voters reported waiting in line 5 to 8 hours. There were voters in Georgia who reported waiting over 10 hours just to cast a ballot. The problem of long voting lines disproportionately affects non-white and low-income neighborhoods with fewer and fewer polling places than more affluent and predominantly white neighborhoods, which have average wait times of around half as long as predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods. For many Native Americans, especially those living on reservations, voting poses tremendous challenges, especially this year with the pandemic. And I'll just give one example. In the Navajo Nation, most homes are in rural areas without street names or addresses. And for many Navajo, mailing in a ballot requires traveling around 140 miles round trip to reach the nearest polling place, or the nearest post office, rather. The lack of a residential address, for various reasons, disenfranchises voters who are unable to match an address with voter rolls, and voters without addresses often don't receive election mail in time, if at all. Just to give you a sense of the disparities in Arizona alone, the city of Scottsdale is about 184 square miles and has 12 post offices. The Navajo Nation is over 27,000 square miles and has just 26 post offices total. That's larger than the state of West Virginia, which has over 650 post offices. So you can see, just in terms of access to mailing, there's structural inequalities that shape who has access to the ballot and who doesn't. So you can see here in some of the topics I've laid out, there's a spectrum of voter suppression, from legal denials of citizenship and voting rights to structural dynamics that present all but insurmountable hurdles to the ballot box. The critique of voter suppression historically has come from the left and from the disempowered who have been denied voting rights. But lately, we've seen it also from the highest office in the land. The president just on Monday tweeted that polls in Michigan and Wisconsin were tantamount to voter suppression because they suggested that Joe Biden had a larger lead than he actually did. What's kind of interesting and bizarre about that claim is that votes have been historically suppressed by conservatives to counter alleged voter fraud, which, by the way, has never been shown to occur at any significant scale in the US. So what's especially strange to think about Trump's version of voter suppression is that it coexists with a claim to voter fraud, when usually these claims have been at odds. Right? Voter fraud has been a rationale for suppressing votes historically. So with all the chaos of the present in mind, I'd like to think about what to make of the past and present of voter suppression, and of what voter suppression means or ought to mean to us today. And now I'll turn to our illustrious panel to help us think through these issues, and let me introduce them first. We'll start with Dr. Precious Hall, who is a tenured professor of political science at Truckee Meadows Community College here in Reno, Nevada, where she has taught since 2012. She hails from Baltimore, Maryland, having completed her undergraduate studies at High Point University in North Carolina and graduate studies at Georgia State University in Atlanta in the fields of American government and politics, political behavior, and political theory. Through her lens of research, she has investigated minority politicians in the post-Obama government and the rhetoric and style of campaigns used by African-American politicians in the notion of a post-racial society. Presently, her research focuses on how African-American politicians continue to relate to the majority electorate and how the majority electorate's attitudes shift in regards to racial considerations. In 2018, she was nominated for the Reno Gazette Journal's TMCC Faculty Excellence in Teaching Award. Let's welcome Precious.
Thank you.
Natalie Van Hooser is a freelance multimedia journalist and translator based in Reno. She reports in both English and Spanish for KUNR Public Radio, the NPR member station, which serves Northern Nevada and part of Northern California. Since the pandemic started, she has reported on public health, education, immigration, and most recently, the 2020 general election. She is also the U.S. ambassador for Sembra Media, a Spanish language media nonprofit dedicated to supporting Spanish language media entrepreneurs. She graduated from UNR in 2018 with a bachelor's degree in journalism and Spanish. Welcome to Natalie.
Thanks so much.
Dr. Greta de Jong is a professor in the Department of History at the University of Nevada, Reno. Her research focuses on the connections between race and class and the ways that African Americans have fought for economic as well as political rights from the end of Reconstruction through the 21st century. Her most recent book is You Can't Eat Freedom, Southerners and Social Justice After the Civil Rights Movement, published by University of North Carolina Press in 2016. She is currently working on a study of school desegregation in Boston in the 1970s. Welcome, Greta. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Hello, everybody.
So to get the conversation started, I thought I would rewind, think about the history of voter suppression, and maybe start by posing a question to Greta, though certainly Precious and Natalie, feel free to chime in. Greta, you've written on voter suppression tactics in the South throughout the 20th century. Could you talk to us a bit about how African-American votes have been suppressed after the passing of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which promised that no one could be denied voting rights based on, according to the language of the amendment, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So could you talk to us a little bit about how suppression has happened for African Americans post 15th Amendment?
Yes. So the post-Civil War era, the era called Reconstruction, was when the 15th Amendment was passed, and that opened up a lot of political participation by African American men in the South who voted in very high numbers and were elected to political office. And African Americans helped to elect more progressive Republican-dominated state governments in the South during that period in the late 1860s and 1870s. And just as a reminder, in the 19th century, the Republican Party was the party of abolition and supported Black civil rights, and the Democratic Party supported slavery and white supremacy. So the election of these Republican governments was really good for African Americans and also for poor white Southerners as well. They passed a lot of legislation that was in the interests of working people and poor people. They created the first public schools in the South, things like that. This upset a lot of white Southerners who did not think that African Americans should be participating in politics. It particularly upset the wealthy plantation owners who were used to running everything in the South and didn't like the reforms that these new Republican governments were implementing. So they mobilized to regain control of those state governments in the South using intimidation and violence. And this was the era when the first Ku Klux Klan emerged and really kind of operated as kind of a paramilitary terrorist wing of the Democratic Party, threatening people, beating people up, murdering their political opponents, really directly suppressing voter participation by African Americans and also white Republicans as well. So eventually all the Southern state governments, because of those tactics, came back under Democratic Party control. And then in the 1880s and 1890s, they were able to pass legislation that aimed to prevent African Americans and also poor white people often from voting. So it was things like literacy tests and poll taxes and residency requirements, disqualifying people if they had committed minor crimes, those kinds of things. Now, because of the 15th Amendment, they couldn't directly disfranchise people on the basis of race, but they targeted things that they associated with African Americans. It was really class-based, and partly what they were trying to do was just to prevent poor people more generally from participating in politics. And the removal of African Americans from politics in the South allowed for the construction of the Jim Crow system, which segregated and exploited and oppressed African Americans in that region for the next half century. So then that all lasted until 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and the Voting Rights Act outlawed a lot of those restrictive eligibility requirements and allowed federal registrars to go down to the South and register African Americans in the South. But even after the Voting Rights Act was passed, there was still a lot of disincentives to African Americans to vote. They were still, a lot of them, economically dependent on white employers who often would fire them or evict them from their homes if they registered to vote after the Voting Rights Act. There were all kinds of ways that the state and local governments found to get around the Voting Rights Act, things like redrawing congressional districts, gerrymandering, basically to make it hard for Black candidates to get elected. They restricted their places and hours of polling places, made it harder for people to register to vote. They closed polling places in predominantly Black neighborhoods and counties. In some places, they converted elected political officers to appointed officers so that you wouldn't even have a chance to elect someone in those offices. So there are all kinds of ways to discourage people from voting, whereas previously it was the Democrats who are most interested in voter suppression. It's now more often Republicans because of the party realignment that was caused by the Democratic Party's support for Black civil rights in the 1960s, right? So that caused a lot of white voters to switch parties, whereas African Americans have pretty reliably voted for the Democrats, and they've become the Democrats' most reliable voting constituency. And so it's in the Republican Party's interest to discourage them from voting. So in the late 20th century and up until today, it's mostly been Republican state legislatures and the Republican Party that has been trying to discourage people from voting.
That is really a tremendous condensed history of a lot of complex dynamics at work. Thank you for that. Unless anybody wants to chime in, I had a question for Precious, maybe kind of transitioning into the question of African American disenfranchisement too. I know, Precious, some of your work has been about roadblocks for young people seeking to participate in elections. Could you tell us a little bit about what factors have contributed to depressing voter turnout among young people?
Okay, sure. I think one of the first things that we have to acknowledge is when it comes to the youth vote, and depends on which organization you look at it. Some define between 18 to 25, some 18 to 29. But let's, for the sake of this conversation, say under 30. I think the youth get a bad rap in the sense that, well, since they're typically the lowest percentage and lowest age group in terms of voter turnout, that they're very apathetic or they just don't care. And that's not the reality of what's happening in our country. For those of us who are over the age of 30, think about how much transition we went through in our lives between the ages of 18 and 30. That encompasses graduating from high school, moving away from home, potentially going away to college, potentially having children, getting married, etc. It is a time of a lot of instability. And that instability, coupled with the fact that we do not have uniformed voter registration in this country, is one of the biggest barriers that we see. So, so many people will say, well, but don't we register students to vote in high school? Most high schools actually do that. But what we don't take into account is if a student, a senior, is registered in high school, but they go away to college, do we teach them how to be able to engage in absentee voting, how to get a absentee ballot, or do we even teach them that they have to vote in the county in which they're registered in? Many people don't understand that, especially young voters. In addition, if I am 18 years old and new to this process, maybe I know that in my state, I have to be registered to vote at least 45 days prior to an election. But in some states, it's 30 days. Some individuals think that they can do same day voter registration. So it's very confusing, particularly when you're looking to do it as a young person for the first time. So that's one of the major things that we have to acknowledge is it's just a big time of transition. And because there's no universal system of registration and you have to be registered to vote where you have to be registered where you are. That's a big hurdle. The second hurdle that we have to understand, and this sort of correlates with wealth, we are one of the few democracies in which voting is not a national holiday. So, who's more likely to have to go to school on election day? Young people. Who's more likely to have those hourly wage jobs where if they literally don't go to work, they don't get paid? Young people. And it's easy for us who are a bit settled, a bit older, a bit comfortable financially to say, well, they can't lose their job if they go vote. But even though that may be true, If I'm a young person and I'm responsible for paying bills and I have to make a choice between losing out on 1 to 2 hours of pay and going to vote, we really, in an economic and logical sense, can't blame that person for choosing to stay at work, choosing to work if they have overtime, which means that they aren't able to vote. We see that in terms of voter suppression, what has happened in a few states, they don't allow early voting, and some states are making it increasingly difficult to engage in early voting. When we think about young people as well, particularly in a university setting, if a young person goes away to college, they live on campus, but there's no polling location close to campus. And that campus doesn't offer shuttles to be able to go and vote, and that student doesn't have a car. It makes it more difficult. We've seen stories in the past few years, particularly, I'm going to point out the state of Texas here on this one, where we've seen laws deliberately limiting the number of polling places and polling locations. For example, I was reading an article not too long ago. The University of Texas at Austin has over 40,000 students that attend, and all they were only allowed to have 2 polling locations. Well, with 40,000 students, 2 polling locations, there were stories of some students who had to wait upwards of 6 or 7 hours in line to go vote. Well, as a student, my primary job is to go to class and to do well. I can't necessarily afford to spend 5, 6, 7 hours waiting to go and vote. So, what we see is not suppression deliberately targeted towards young people, but we see adverse effects on young people with the tactics that currently exist.
That's excellent. I think that that's an important topic to kind of circulate throughout our discussion, the unintended consequences of some policies that are maybe not intentionally imagined as forms of voter suppression, but have the effects of suppressing votes.
And final thing I forgot to mention, voter ID laws. So
Mhm.
this also correlates with wealth too. If I am someone who doesn't have a lot of money, that means that I'm not going to be a typical youth where as soon as I turn 16 or 17, I'm going to be able to go and get my driver's license or go and get an ID. It will take me longer to establish those things for myself. And if I live in a place that doesn't accept a student ID, many states don't. You have to have a valid government ID. That also means that I might miss out on my opportunity to vote. And again, that's not something that's targeted specifically towards young people, but we see those adverse effects.
Absolutely. Thank you, Precious. I have a question for Natalie, and thank you all in the audience, by the way. We're getting your questions. These are really excellent questions. We're going to get to them right after this question I posed to Natalie about some of her journalism. Natalie, you've reported on language access barriers for voters, and I'm curious to hear you speak about what you found in your reporting about how language access affects voters, especially here in Nevada.
Right. And thank you for that context, setting up this discussion so well, Professors DeJong and Hall. And to give a little bit of context about what I've been working on as a bilingual reporter at KUNR Public Radio, which is our NPR affiliate station here for Northern Nevada. The stories we do in English air on the radio, and then we do a Spanish version, which includes audio and text, which goes online. So my work has covered that, looking at the elections as well. We also did an online in Spanish Facebook Live event to answer questions about the voting process. So some of the information I have has been informed through those type of engagement events too. And so a lot of my work for this election was talking to first-time voters, and the people that I ended up talking to were people who were first-time voters because they had just become citizens. One story I did, which you can find this work too on the KUNR website. If you go to the staff and search me, all of these stories related to voting are under my name. And so one family in Northern Nevada just all became citizens Well, the parents and the older daughter who I spoke to became citizens this year, and then the younger brother turned 18. So there were different reasons that this family was voting for the first time and figuring out how to do it together. And so their interview is a nice anecdote to explain some of these language access barriers that we see. And the parents, they understand English, and but they still prefer to really understand things in Spanish. That's the language that's comfortable for their family. And so as they were figuring out this whole process together, their children, primarily their daughter, would look up these topics which are complicated enough to understand on your ballot in English, and then try to figure out what they were saying in, common speak, and then explain that to her parents in Spanish. And so that was kind of the process they did. And that was after they figured out how to do registration and things like that. And to get to that point, she said they used a lot of social media from different nonprofits in the area, putting out different, Instagram stories and things like that that gave them the steps to go register and things. So they navigated all of that in English, and then they were figuring out how to fill out their ballot in Spanish. But if we're looking more widely at other languages too, the ballots in Nevada are provided in both English and Spanish. And then if you go to vote at a polling location, those kiosks, the ballot to fill out your ballot there, are also in Spanish. But those are the only two languages that are available. So that's one thing that you see right off the bat, is that even in Spanish, it's hard enough to figure out what to do, let alone if you're trying to vote and you're dominant in a language that isn't English. To do our events, like our engagement event, I reached out to the registrar's office for voter registration here in Northern Nevada for Washoe County. And they said if people had questions in Spanish, they do have some bilingual staff in Spanish and English, and you can go down to the registrar's office and ask questions that way. But when we're talking about things like access, like Professors DeJong and Hall have mentioned, being able to go do something like that under normal circumstances takes a certain amount of flexibility and time to be able to take out to go get those types of questions answered. And then we've seen everything get that much more complicated with the pandemic too, with people who are not able to go in person to a location like that and get questions answered. So mail ballot voting has proved to be something that's been useful to the people I interviewed as first-time voters in regards to language. They were able to sit down at home and research it and fill it out together and ask their friends and their family members in whatever language made sense to them how to do it. And so I know they said that really helped them be comfortable voting for the first time this election, and that they hope they have that option going forward.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, these are really practical concerns that people are facing, which brings me to some of the questions that our audience has been asking. I want to synthesize a couple of them. So a couple of the audience members have asked versions of hearing you all speak about what voting reforms can actually be established that seem feasible, they seem doable, that could address a lot of these concerns, that could help combat voter suppression for the various groups that we've been discussing: young people, African Americans, foreign language speakers or non-English speakers. So I'd be curious to see how each of you would respond to the question of what reforms could actually be executed that would address some of these issues.
I can start us off on that. A few that a few states are adopting, but that are simple reforms, things like automatic registration, things such as same-day registration. So once the dust settles on this election, it'll be particularly interesting to see if in Nevada that automatic registration has made a difference. This was the first election that we had since automatic registration began and was voted in. So it'll be curious once the dust, I know Nevada was in the news for various reasons last week. So once the dust settles on all of that, it'll be interesting to see if that potentially had any sort of effect. But automatic registration is a simple reform. Same day voter registration is a simple reform. Getting rid of voter ID laws is a reform, but if you're insisting on having voter ID laws, providing free government issued IDs would be a simple reform as well. It's unfair to have one and not the other because it becomes the equivalent of having to pay a fee in order to vote. And it's easy for us who have IDs, who have bank accounts, to say, well, it's easy to get an ID or everybody has one. But the reality is we actually have upwards of almost 12% of the population that lives and exists without a valid form of government ID. And when we talk about reforms, we have to think about reforms not just for us as individuals, but for the least of these, those who aren't where we are, where things could become a bit tougher. But automatic registration, same day voter registration, I'm in favor of making voting a national holiday as well. Those are things that could easily be done.
That actually addresses another one of our questions. Do you all recommend that Election Day be a national holiday? Maybe roll that into your responses, Greta and Natalie.
I'm always in favor of more holidays. And Election Day is a natural holiday. It should be something that is celebrated and that is fun, and people, should be able to relax on Election Day and go and vote and then watch the results come in. I think this election has shown that mail-in ballots, as Natalie was talking about, and also early voting, which has been in some states for a while and which were actually really central to Barack Obama's victory in 2008. Those massively increase voter turnout, because it's not all compressed on that one day, and the lines can be shorter and people can plan to go and vote when it suits them. And I became a citizen in 2016. Here's where I tell my story. I became a citizen in May of 2016. And in November 2016, America broke my heart. It was just horrible. So I voted 2016 and midterms in 2018 and this year. But every time I've been so grateful to be in Nevada, which does have, an ethos of, at least recently, encouraging people to vote. And so I found it very easy and not much time at all to go and vote. And I just wish it was like that for everyone in every state.
Right. And related to that, also going back to mail ballots, the people I spoke to all did early voting and mail ballot voting. So that to me gave me a sense of the fact that those two things are really useful with helping people. And the fact that mail ballots are a way that people can vote when they have time to around their work schedule, making an election day holiday would also speak to that same need. So I know with the people I spoke to, yes, that would definitely be something that would be extremely useful. As far as other types of reforms that could help, if we're thinking about language access, even with my research to be able to do things like our online engagement event in Spanish, helping people figure out how to register and then vote and how to do that with the different pandemic regulations we have in place. Even the information that was available in Spanish was not necessarily easy to find, and it was provided on pages that you had to navigate to in English in order to get there. So I think additional thought about how to present information in Spanish would help a large portion of our population, and then having information available in languages aside from Spanish would definitely require more funding as far as to get information and election materials in those languages as well.
That's great. Thank you. One of the questions from audience member Raphael Cohen, a question posed for Precious especially, but I'd be curious to hear all of you respond to this one as well. Why is early voting not established in all 50 states? It seems like such an easy decision to make to avoid election day issues. So why are some states blocking this ability? And maybe more broadly, what motivates forms of voter suppression? Like who decides, or why would they decide we actually want to put up roadblocks to voting?
Okay, so first and foremost, I'll start off using the Constitution. So the Constitution specifies we have amendments. If you're 18 and older, women, you can't deny the right to vote based on color, previous condition of servitude. So basically, you're a citizen, 18 or older, you get to vote in this country, or you're eligible to vote in this country. The Constitution also prescribes when general elections take place. They take place in November, the first Tuesday in November, after the first Monday every 2 years. But the Constitution also says that the time, place, and manner of elections are left to the individual states. So each state gets to decide the time, the place, and the manner. As long as people are allowed to vote in November, everything else is left to the states to decide. So that's the constitutional foundation for why it differs and we don't have one national law. But to get to the deeper question of why some states choose to make it easier to engage in early voting or registration, et cetera, and some states don't. If I were a conspiracy theorist, which I'm not, but if I were, the answer to that question would be, we have to look at who benefits at keeping a narrow scope for who actually shows up to vote. So what studies and statistics actually show us is that early voting and mail-in ballots are used more by Democrats. Republicans typically vote more the day of the election. Now, if you ask why that is, we have to then look at everything else that we've said, and we also have to have a conversation about wealth and the disparity of wealth in our country. If there are a lot of individuals who have not achieved a certain status of wealth, but they're registered as Democrats, the more options, the better. Meaning, if I don't have to miss work to go vote, I don't have to miss school, I can plan it around all the other obligations that I have going on, it works better for me. But if I am a certain job status, a certain wealth class, it doesn't matter to me that voting is Tuesday in the middle of my week. I can take the time to go vote. So I'll use myself as an example. I am a US citizen. I've been able to vote in multiple elections. This was the first election that I exercised my option to do a mail-in ballot and take it in person. I study political science. I am somebody, I get up at 7 a.m. on election day. I go to the polls first thing like that. I like to do that. If it takes me hours, and it's never, by the way, taking me longer than 2 hours to vote. The longest it ever took me to vote on election day was in 2008 when Barack Obama, I was living in Atlanta and Barack Obama it was his first election, but it's never taking me long to do so. But this year, for various reasons, I exercised my right to do that. But I've had the luxury to be able to, if I need to go into work late and do that in order to vote, no questions asked, no consequence, because I have a certain level of education that's granted me a certain career that allows me to do that. We don't have a majority of people, particularly when we look at sort of the Democratic Party and just in wealth structures, which wealth demographics belong to that party, that not a majority don't have the ability to be able to do that. So to answer the question, we have to look at who benefits from narrowing the voter pool, who benefits from fewer people being able to vote, and we will land on one particular party.
Greta or Natalie, I wondered if you wanted to respond to the question of what motivates voter suppression, or why not make early voting available for everybody?
Yeah, well, I think, there are definitely people who don't want everyone to vote, even today. And historically, the motivation has been, well, even going back to the Constitution, right, which was framed by property owners, a lot of them slaveholders. There were debates at the Constitutional Convention about the extent of democracy that should be allowed, and the Constitution was set up in ways that limited the amount of democracy involved in choosing our national leaders. And so it comes down to this fear of property owners that the non-property owners, who are always the majority, are going to elect people to office who will take away from the property owners and try to redistribute wealth in a more equitable way. And I think that's been the constant motivation through this nation's history, and I think it still motivates some of the people who are trying to limit voting today.
We have a
Yeah,
question.
and
Oh, Natalie, go ahead.
oh yeah, just to add quickly on just the idea of like the unintentional voter suppression as well. A lot of what I saw wasn't even deliberate attempts of suppressing people's right to vote, but as far as like language access, it was just that things were not laid out in a way that people could easily get to, and those kinds of things would be solved by taking the time to, you know, have a test group and see if it worked for people. So part of it too is just seeing what works for users.
Absolutely. I think a lot of these structures that we're talking about assume a certain identity or set of identities that these, you know, systems are designed for, right? So ballots written in labyrinthine legalese, right, are obviously designed for native English speakers who are highly educated. We have a question from AJ Matthew. I'm curious to know if any of you have insights on this, because I don't really. Could there be a way for people to vote online? Would that raise security issues? That seems like a democratizing, way of solving a lot of these voting issues.
I think there may be security issues, but I know from experience that it's possible because that's how I vote in the New Zealand elections. For years, I was disfranchised in both places, both in New Zealand and the US, and now I'm a dual citizen and I can vote in both places, my country of origin and here. So I did actually vote. They allow people overseas to vote online. I don't think they allow it for everyone. I think that would maybe, get really complicated and raise a lot of security issues, but it was very easy. All I needed to do was download my voting papers, fill them out, get someone to witness me signing them, and then I just uploaded them to the site. So it's possible.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that also, only with my personal experience. I was supposed to be in Argentina during these general elections, so I got all set up to vote, as a U.S. citizen overseas. And Nevada did implement a online voting system this year, I believe was the first year, in addition to being able to scan in paper ballots to the registrar of voters office. They have an online system that they're working on using for voters overseas. So it's definitely something that is being worked on, at least for those absentee voters.
Yeah, theoretically, it's definitely possible. The issue that most people bring up are the security issues, and and it's a couple issues in terms of security. How do we ensure that the person that says they're voting online is actually them? How do we protect ourselves from outside foreign influencers or even inside hackers who just want to have fun on the day of election? And how do we do it on a large scale? So there are military service members who are allowed to vote online. There are people out of the country, not everyone, but in special circumstances, that are allowed to vote online. But that's small scale compared to when we look at presidential elections, we're talking upwards of more than 100 million people who would be looking to use technically the same system. So you do have the security issues, but then also too, in order to do it, you would have to be willing to give up your anonymity in terms of not just that you voted, but who you voted for. Are people comfortable with that? Are they not? But the main points that people bring up are the security issues and how do we translate, yes, we have a small number who do it now, but how do we make that available? And we would still have to do both mobile voting or online voting and in-person voting, because again, we have to think about those who don't have access to this same technology.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't solve the problem of accessibility completely. To that question of accessibility, we've touched on this a little bit, but we have a question from Rachel McGrath who asks, how are the number of polling stations in a certain location determined, and why are they so limited in certain locations? Is there a way to solve the issue of long lines or crowded polling places?
Well, again, so each state does determine literally the location of polling places, and that's the Constitution, time, place, and manner restrictions. Here's the without going making my answer too long, the unfortunate reality is that there are ways to challenge polling locations, but it mainly involves going through the court. And it has to be housed under an equitable access, i.e., the 14th Amendment. So, is it fair that for some people they're quarter of a mile or half a mile from their nearest polling location, and for others they're 10 or 15 miles? It becomes an equitable issue. But also on top of that, the people who are most impacted also tend to be the ones who don't have the resources to be able to go through the litigation to challenge the issues. And remember, when we look at our legal system here, it's not just that a group can come in and say this is unfair and we're going to, sue or take this to court. You actually have to have at least one person who's been disproportionately impacted. And sometimes it's hard to find a person who's willing to be the face of a lawsuit to get these things settled. So it's possible, but it's not easy. And that's how, unfortunately, these people get away with these things, because the ones who are disproportionately impacted have the least resources to fight against what's happening.
Absolutely. So we keep coming back to this question of resources and, limited voting rights. I know from, or limited polling places in more impoverished areas, they're closed down for economic reasons, ostensibly. I think there's probably some other motivations for governors deciding to close down polling places, but the obvious one on the surface is we can reduce the number of polling locations, and that saves some money. I wanted to address a question from Ruthie Meadows, who asks a controversial question about the Electoral College. I thought this would be something that might have come up earlier, but there's a lot of talk over the past few years about eliminating the Electoral College because of its complex kind of intersection with voting suppression. So Ruthie puts the question this way: how does the fight for access reforms such as automatic registration, multilingual polls, that question just went away. Hold on, let me recover it. Here we go. Okay. How does the fight for access reforms such as automatic registration, multilingual polls, and/or a national holiday relate, in your opinion, to a broader push for eliminating the Electoral College? And do these face similar or different political barriers? And maybe we could start with Greta on that question. I'd be curious to hear what you think about the Electoral College and its contribution to voter suppression.
Yeah, sorry, I think it was my fault that the question went away, because I realized I now have the option of typing an answer to a question. So I typed the link in or pasted a link in. So the link had to do with an initiative called National Popular Vote, which is trying to get state legislatures to pass legislation agreeing that they would award their electoral college votes to whoever was the winner of the popular vote, regardless of who won their own state. And it takes effect when a certain number of states, adding up to 270 electoral college votes, sign on. So that was just kind of in relation to the electoral college, which is, it's one of the anti-democratic aspects of the Constitution, and it was deliberately designed that way to insulate the presidency from the popular vote by, putting this intermediate step in there. And awarding electoral college votes to each state. So sorry, what was the question? Did I answer it at all? That's it.
I was muted, sorry, new to Zoom. Ruthie was asking a question, I think, about the relationship between these different efforts, right? Like multilingual polls, making Election Day a national holiday, automatic registration. How is that kind of related to the Electoral College? Do you see a relation?
Yeah, I think they're all part of this kind of broader push to make the elections more democratic and to encourage participation. Because one way in which the Electoral College suppresses the vote is that if you live in a solidly red state or a solidly blue state, why bother voting, right? Because everyone's just going to outvote you. So that is a disincentive to many people to participate.
maybe building off of that question, we have a question here about not a systemic issue necessarily, but the question of cynicism or pessimism when it comes to voting. I've read that one of the ways in which voter suppression manifests beyond just the long lines that we've seen is that the people that wait in those long lines are discouraged from trying to vote again, and they often withdraw from the electoral process. So what would you say to voters who feel that their votes don't matter, or that, taking off of work one day, that's really not worth it because it's inconsequential, my one vote in this sea of many votes in my state?
Yeah, I could jump in there. So with the first time voters I talked to, obviously the big question was, well, why are you voting now? And for them, part of it was the citizenship piece, but also they were voting for their friends and their family who don't have the ability to vote, many of them undocumented. So I think things like that can help motivate people, even if part of them does think, well, I don't know how much good my one vote will do. I know it's also easier in Nevada, and especially in Washoe County, if you explain the idea of being a swing county and a swing state to people, that can help motivate them in our area. But more generally speaking, I think voting for other people who can't was a big motivator.
Precious, did you want to chime in on that question? I'd be curious to hear what you think about this question, especially with young people. And you were saying, the question of, do I take a day off of work when I could actually earn wages that day?
It's definitely a hard choice for many people. And I am someone who I will always say that, I'm not going to lie and say, well, you know, elections have ever come down to one single vote. But elections have been close, and our definition of close, we're seeing it now, has been a few thousand. But what I always like to tell my students is it absolutely true that your one vote is not going to make a difference in the election? Yes, it is. But it's also equally true that it becomes a cumulative effect. Meaning, if you're the one person who thinks my one vote doesn't matter, so I'm going to stay home on election day, and then I'm the one person, and then there are 10 million other people who think they're the one person, that's the cumulative effect. And that's the issue. So yes, everybody should vote. Every vote does count. It does matter in the cumulative sense. But statistically, it's true that one vote doesn't matter, but you have to think about the broader and the whole as opposed to just the singular one. And that's what a lot of people don't consider. One versus the one times 10 million, yes, that makes a difference.
A question that I had going into this conversation was about the role of education and journalism in promoting democracy. So to Precious's point about, your one vote doesn't matter, but if you think of yourself as, an ethical subject that's a model for all other subjects in the nation that you share, you should vote based on that principle. How do we effectively communicate that kind of, democratic ethos, either through journalism or through education in the classroom?
Yeah, I can talk to the journalism part of it. I think what I've really noticed with this election, and I started, my working on published pieces related to it months before the election to speak to that educational component. And I think much like news literacy is something that we see that many people need, and being able to determine what's accurate and what's not, and what's coming from vetted sources. It's the same thing with voting literacy too, knowing what sources you should consult and which ones are reputable, and who to ask for when you have questions. And so there have been different journalism organizations with initiatives to help with those types of things. Even ProPublica has a Spanish language newsletter, and they've been publishing quite a few different Spanish language resources like voting guides in it. And that's what we've been trying to do too at the local level with our Facebook Live event to answer questions in Spanish. And different organizations like the Nevada Independent have a Spanish section where they had explainers on the ballot questions and things like that. So I think it's coming down to that educational and that literacy component, and that journalism organizations need to spend just as much time explaining the process to people as they do explaining the results. So that comes down at the beginning, telling people how to register and how this can all impact the outcome.
Maybe since we're low on time, I want to shift. Love to hear Precious and Greta speak about that issue of education as well. But to get to other audience questions, we have a question about those convicted of felonies. Should they be allowed to vote? I know there was a law passed in Florida recently that I forget if it overturns the law that determined that ex-cons could not vote or not. But that's one of the ways in which one's legal status has shaped their access to the polls. So I wonder about this question of should one's status as an ex-felon or not determine voting rights?
Well, the felony disfranchisement is a major form of voter suppression. The case in Florida, Florida was one of the states that banned people convicted of felonies for life from voting. So even when they finish their sentences, they're still not allowed to vote. And in 2018, voters in Florida by 65% approved an amendment to restore felons' voting rights. And then the state legislature stepped in and passed legislation forcing those people to pay all their fees and fines and court fees and all of that, which some of them, added up to thousands of dollars. So potentially 1.4 million felons could have had their voting rights restored. In reality, only 300,000 were able to clear their fees and fines and to register to vote. And this has been, this is combined with the disproportionate policing of Black communities and mass incarceration that has landed disproportionate numbers of African Americans in prison where they can't vote. A lot of those prisons are located in predominantly white rural areas where those prisoners count in the population counts for those counties, but they're not allowed to vote. And this is just another way in which, those white Americans get more representation in Congress because of that.
And I'll add just my opinion to that. I absolutely believe that convicted felons should maintain their right to vote. They're still citizens. And when we talk about rates of recidivism, if we don't incorporate them fully back into society, how can we expect them to want to try to do anything differently than what they've done before? I am also, and this is controversial, I'm a proponent of allowing them to vote while in prison. But the reason I am a proponent of that is because of what Professor DeJong just pointed out. If they're counted as part of the population for representation for where they are, they should be able to vote where they are. Until we change that, I will not change my particular stance on that, because we can't use them in one sense and then disenfranchise them in another. That just gives a separate demographic more power to be able to suppress people's voices. So I'm in favor of those outside of jail who serve their time voting, and I'm in favor of those who are currently serving time to continue to be able to vote.
You can see that the representation issue, it's an extension of the 3/5 compromise, right, which overrepresented slaveholding states without giving enslaved African Americans the right to vote. We are wrapping up on time, sadly. I wish we could continue to talk about this important topic, but I have to close things up. Thank you all in the audience for your tremendous questions. And I want to thank the Thought on Tap Committee, including Bretton Rodriguez and Carlos Mariscal, Danielle Enrique Perez, Meredith Oda, Catherine Fusco, and Callum Ingram. Special thanks to Caitlin Early for helping to plan tonight's panel and for managing the Q&A. I want to thank Deborah Modelmog, Lisa McDonald, and the College of Liberal Arts, as well as Chris Stansel and Rishi Bednarski for their support for tonight's event. Thank you to our partners, Laughing Planet, Nevada Humanities, and K-Wink. And I want to thank our fantastic panelists, of course, Precious Hall, Natalie Van Hooser, and Greta DeYoung. Most of all, I want to thank you all in the audience, especially those of you who reached out and asked questions. That was tremendous conversation driven by your really engaging and thoughtful questions, so thank you. Once this session ends, you'll receive a survey in your email. We'd love to hear your feedback on tonight's event. We use that feedback to plan future events. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. And take care. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.